Welcome back to our channel. In this video, you'll find the brightness of a child prodigy who took Hollywood and the music industry by storm, but also the shadows of a man who never found peace within his own mind. You'll hear of a gifted musician shaped by gospel roots, tested by the temptations of the spotlight, and forever marked by secrets that tormented him from an early age. You'll witness fleeting joys, prolonged sorrows, and a legacy that remains both luminous and deeply tarnished. Above all, you'll meet a human being, flawed, extraordinary, tragic, who spent his life in a constant search for love, acceptance, and spiritual salvation. Billy Preston's life began on September 2nd, 1946, in Houston, Texas. His birth name was William Everett Preston, but no one who saw him in his early years would ever call him ordinary. He was just a toddler when his family moved to Los Angeles, where his mother, Robbie Lee Williams, found work as a church singer and occasional performer. From a young age, Billy displayed a natural inclination for music. According to one archived interview, Robbie said that even before he could talk, he would tap out simple rhythms on pots and pans or hum random tunes that he must have picked up from the radio. By the time he was 3, he was already mesmerizing churchgoers by climbing onto the piano bench and playing back the hymns he heard by ear. It was the kind of effortless talent that made older musicians shake their heads in disbelief. Everyone sensed that something miraculous was unfolding. Los Angeles in the 1950s was a thriving city with a vibrant African-American gospel scene. Filled with community choirs, storefront churches, and traveling evangelists, it was a cradle for soul music. A child with Billy's talents was bound to be noticed. When he was just 10 years old, Billy was performing on local television shows, making cameos at revivals, and gaining a reputation as a boy wonder. Around that time, a friend of his mother's introduced him to the legendary gospel singer Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia was so taken by Billy's gift that she reportedly declared, "This boy's got angels perched on his fingers." The church was more than just a place of worship for Billy. It was where he developed his style, blending sanctified piano and organ chords with flamboyant improvisation. It was also, paradoxically, one of the earliest sources of his deepest personal pain. One of the complexities of Billy's early life was the physical and emotional abuse he suffered. In later years, Billy would quietly share that he was molested as a child by a local pastor, a traumatic revelation that left him terrified and confused. It also cast a lifelong shadow on his perceptions of faith and intimacy. On one hand, gospel music was his anchor, the place where he discovered God's presence and a sense of purpose. On the other, religion was tied to a painful memory that haunted him, creating an inner conflict he was never able to fully resolve. This conflict would deepen as he grew older and became more aware of his sexuality. Raised in a conservative religious community, Billy struggled with the realization that he was attracted to men. The same churches that nurtured his musical talent also condemned homosexual desire, instilling in him a sense of shame and self-doubt that would plague him for decades to come. Despite these early struggles, Billy found moments of pure joy in his musical pursuits. By the age of 11, he was a recognized prodigy around Los Angeles. He even had a small role in the 1958 film St. Louis Blues, starring Nat King Cole. The movie told the story of legendary blues composer W.C. Handy, and Billy's cameo marked his first brush with Hollywood. Though brief, it allowed him to experience professional life in the entertainment industry at an age when most kids were busy riding bikes and doing homework. Those who met him in those years would later say they remembered him as a bright-eyed, exuberant child who carried the sound of a Sunday service in his soul and a hidden sadness in his eyes. Not long afterward, Billy caught the attention of another gospel legend, James Cleveland. Cleveland took the boy under his wing, inviting Billy to perform in various church concerts and revivals. Cleveland's support helped Billy expand his repertoire to include everything from classic hymns to the more modern soulful style that was beginning to break through in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This immersive experience in gospel was Billy's foundation. No matter how far he eventually traveled in the realms of rock, soul, funk, and pop, you could always hear the church in his playing. The dramatic swells on the Hammond B3 organ, the spirited call and response style of his phrasing, the emotional fervor that made his performances feel like a spiritual encounter, all were rooted in that early gospel training. By the time Billy was in his early teens, his talent had attracted the attention of many in the music world, including the young Sam Cooke, who, like Billy, had moved from gospel into secular music. Billy joined Sam Cooke on a European tour around 1962, and this was the moment when young Billy Preston experienced the euphoria of the international stage. He was just 16 years old, touring with a star, playing to packed crowds in places like London, Paris, and Hamburg. Although overshadowed by Cooke's celebrity, Billy dazzled audiences with his energetic organ solos and soulful voice. Fate intervened during that European tour. In Hamburg, Germany, a popular club scene pulsated with the raw energy of a fledgling rock band known as the Beatles. It was the early 1960s, and the Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, were honing their craft in crowded nightclubs, playing night after night to rowdy audiences. Although official records vary on the exact timeline of their first meeting, legend has it that Billy first crossed paths with Beatles guitarist George Harrison during this Hamburg period. At the time, Billy was a teenage gospel organist from Los Angeles, while the Beatles were rough-around-the-edges lads from Liverpool. Yet something clicked, a mutual respect for each other's energy and raw talent. They joked around backstage, jammed a bit, and parted ways without suspecting that destiny would bring them together again in a big way later on. When Billy returned to America, he began to carve out a career of his own. He signed with VJ Records in the early 1960s, releasing his first album, 16-Year-Old Soul, which showcased his instrumental skills. Critics praised the young musician's dexterity on the keys, but noted his sound was still heavily rooted in gospel. Billy was eager to expand beyond the church style, but deep within, he clung to the warmth of that spiritual foundation. More album releases followed, including The Most Exciting Organ Ever in 1965, an apt title that captured the vibrant, playful nature of Billy's playing. Session work also began to pour in. Music luminaries sought Billy out to record keyboard tracks because of his unique feel, equal parts sanctified and edgy, a perfect blend for the emerging soul and rock scenes. His name was becoming a fixture in Los Angeles session circles, and as the mid-1960s gave way to the psychedelic era, Billy's phone rang more and more. He played with the likes of Little Richard, Ray Charles, and eventually crossed paths with the Rolling Stones. But the real turning point came in early 1969 when his old friend from Hamburg, George Harrison, invited him to join the Beatles in London during the tense Get Back sessions. The Beatles were facing internal turmoil, relationships were strained, tempers were flaring, and the dream they had built seemed on the verge of unraveling. Into this storm walked Billy Preston, a radiant smile on his face, carrying that gospel-inspired warmth in his fingertips. The Beatles welcomed him like an oasis in the desert. Immediately, Billy's presence changed the mood in the studio. His effervescent spirit and his remarkable command of the keys brought a new kind of energy. One memorable anecdote has John Lennon leaning over to Paul McCartney and saying something along the lines of, "Let's make him a Beatle." While that was more of a quip than a formal offer, It reflected how much the Beatles appreciated the spark Billy brought. His name soon appeared on the Get Back single as a featured artist, an incredibly rare honor. Officially credited as The Beatles with Billy Preston, he became, in the eyes of many fans, the fifth Beatle. He also appeared on tracks such as Don't Let Me Down and contributed to the Abbey Road sessions, further solidifying his place in Beatles lore. Yet Billy's relationship with the Beatles was more than just a session gig. He became a confidant, someone who could lighten the mood with a joke, who brought that soulful exuberance that the four bandmates had once found so naturally, but were losing to fame, stress, and creative disagreements. Indeed, Paul McCartney once commented that having Billy around motivated everyone to be on their best behavior. Decades later, historians would note how crucial Billy Preston was in guiding the Beatles through their final chapters. But success with the Beatles wasn't Billy's only claim to fame. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw him forging a brilliant solo career, releasing a string of hits like That's the Way God Planned It, Outa-Space, Will It Go Round in Circles, and Nothing from Nothing. His spirited performances, often featuring the swirling Hammond organ and a knack for improvisational breaks, made him a crowd favorite. He had an irrepressible stage presence, flying fingers, a big toothy grin, and a voice that soared. Nevertheless, stardom brought its own perils. The same business that applauded him for his musical genius did not always offer a safe space for Billy's complex personal life. He fought inner battles related to his abuse, his sexuality, and an increasing dependence on drugs, cocaine in particular. In a profession that romanticized indulgence, Billy lost sight of moderation. At first, the substances were an escape from painful childhood memories. Then they became a necessity to numb the confusion he felt about his sexual identity, especially in an era when being openly gay or bisexual was fraught with stigma. But as time went on, the cycle deepened. Drugs promised fleeting relief, but led to more turmoil and self-destructive behavior. His once bright eyes took on a distant, haunted look. Meanwhile, he found some solace in religion, returning often to a Christian faith that had shaped him from childhood. He hoped that his gospel roots might help banish his demons. It was not unusual to see Billy performing a soulful church number one night and a rock riff the next. The dichotomy summed up his life, a constant struggle between sacred and secular, between longing for acceptance and coping with condemnation. The 1970s proved a pivotal time for Billy's career. He not only co-wrote You Are So Beautiful, which became a massive hit for Joe Cocker, but also toured and recorded with the Rolling Stones, adding a funky dimension to their sound. He even joined George Harrison for the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, delivering a show-stopping performance that many consider one of the highlights of that historic event. The applause, the collaborations, the adoration, these were the moments he lived for. Yet offstage, the spiral into addiction worsened. Friends noticed that Billy's mood swung erratically. He could be ebullient and generous one day, and withdrawn or paranoid the next. Money slipped through his fingers to support his habit. Rumors began to swirl about legal troubles, including run-ins with the law related to drug possession. The lovable fifth Beatle persona grew complicated as tabloids latched onto sensational stories. By the early 1980s, Billy's star had dimmed. Although he still possessed the talent to enthrall any audience, the business side of music had changed, and younger artists were coming up. The relentless cycle of addiction, arrests, and legal entanglements took its toll on his reputation. Some in the industry tried to stage interventions, others distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged into Billy's chaos. He was caught forging checks in 1991, ultimately leading to a conviction for insurance fraud. Not long after, more serious accusations emerged. Billy was charged with sexual assault of a minor. He faced allegations involving a 16-year-old boy, which was a devastating blow to his already fragile standing. The details of this case remain disturbing, involving claims that mirrored aspects of Billy's own childhood trauma. In a deeply tragic twist, the victim of abuse had himself become an abuser, perpetuating a cycle of pain that Billy seemingly never escaped. After serving time in prison, Billy's health, both mental and physical, deteriorated. He emerged from prison not just with a criminal record, but with a diminished spirit, suffering from ongoing substance abuse issues, depression, and a sense that he'd lost everything he had spent his life building. Scandal overshadowed his artistic accomplishments. The heartbreak of it all was that Billy Preston's name, once synonymous with joyous, life-affirming music, was now linked to headlines about crimes and personal downfall. Yet Billy tried to persevere. In the mid-1990s, he made attempts at comebacks, performing on occasion, collaborating with old friends who still believed in his brilliance. Sometimes he succeeded in conjuring that old spark. Audiences would see glimpses of the unstoppable keyboard wizard who once played with the Beatles. But behind the scenes, the combination of medical issues and drug relapse pulled him deeper into a twilight zone of half-hearted attempts at recovery. By the early 2000s, Billy was facing kidney problems and other health complications that required frequent medical interventions. He eventually ended up in a nursing facility in Arizona, far removed from the limelight of Los Angeles and London. The man who had wowed audiences with soul-stirring Hammond organ solos now spent his days in a place where the primary concern was managing pain and following doctors' orders. It was an incongruous setting for someone whose life had been so vibrant. Billy Preston died on June 6, 2006, at the age of 59. His passing was quiet, almost unnoticed. Although tributes did appear in certain music publications, there was a distinct lack of fanfare compared to the hype that once surrounded him. The industry that had once celebrated him largely moved on. There were no grand memorial concerts, no wave of public mourning. A few close friends attended a small funeral service, and newspapers briefly ran obituaries. It was a sorrowful ending for a man who had brought such joy and innovation to modern music. As one journalist wrote in a heartfelt retrospective, "A giant of the keys left us, and we hardly paused to say goodbye." In reflecting on Billy Preston's life, we see a powerful lesson about the human condition. Here was a child whose extraordinary gifts offered him both an escape from suffering and a road to global stardom. But the success that should have provided happiness came bundled with temptations and pressures that fed his worst impulses. Billy's story reveals how the complexities of abuse, sexual orientation, and religious guilt can converge in devastating ways, especially when you're in the public eye. It also confronts us with the moral dilemma of how to handle the legacies of public figures who commit heinous acts. Do we erase them? Do we revere them? Or do we grapple with the full, uncomfortable truth that both the artistry and the wrongdoing can exist in one body, one mind, one life? Perhaps the best way to honor Billy Preston is to remember him in all his contradictions, his soaring triumphs, and his crippling tragedies. We can acknowledge the staggering beauty of his music, the rapturous sound of his organ solos that once captivated millions. We can appreciate his ability to uplift the Beatles at a time when they desperately needed fresh energy. We can celebrate the joy he brought to concerts, recordings, and late-night jam sessions with people like Ray Charles and Eric Clapton. Simultaneously, we can hold space for the painful reality of childhood abuse, the torment of a closeted identity, and the destructive choices that eventually eclipsed his achievements. It is in this tension between the sublime and the dreadful that Billy Preston's story lives on. For those who grew up in the era when his songs played on the radio, or who came to know him through the Beatles' anthology collections, Billy Preston remains a nostalgic figure, a smiling virtuoso, infectiously enthusiastic, a wizard on the Hammond B3. But for a new generation stumbling across his name, there's a lot more to discover than just some uplifting tunes. Buried in archival footage, you see a man who lights up when he talks about music. In interviews, you catch glimpses of quiet sadness behind the smile. Revisit his stage performances, and you'll see him transform a venue into a revival tent, leading audiences with the fervor of a gospel preacher. Then you learn the rest. The arrests, the allegations, the demise. You realize that Billy Preston is a reflection of how greatness and brokenness can coexist, each fueling the other in a tragic dance. He was no angel, but he was also no mere villain. His story is the age-old struggle of a talented soul wrestling with demons inherited from a troubled childhood. It's a narrative of a man desperately trying to find solace in drugs, in religion, in relationships, but never fully breaking free of the darkness that enveloped him. It's also the story of an industry that offers adulation when you're on top, but too often looks away when you stumble and fall. The same crowd that once gave Billy standing ovations didn't quite know what to do when his transgressions came to light. Perhaps the easiest course was to forget him, which is why his death in a nursing facility felt like an excruciating final note to a life that had soared so high. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.